They laughed at the black janitor's old shoes until he showed them his stock portfolio. The office tower gleamed in the morning light, its glass walls catching the sun and reflecting it down onto the busy street below. Inside, the lobby bustled with the rhythm of business, heels clicking against polished floors, voices rising and falling in hurried conversations, and the hum of elevators carrying people to their destinations. Among the tide of suits and ties moved the janitor, his figure distinct not because of noise or demand, but because of the quiet steadiness with which he walked. His uniform was clean but old. The navy fabric faded from years of washing, the seams at his shoulders slightly frayed. On his feet were shoes that told a longer story. The leather was worn, the soles scuffed from countless steps across these same hallways, their shine long gone despite his efforts to polish them. Employees noticed, as they always did. Some glanced down at his shoes and smirked, others whispered in passing, nudging one another with a cruel sort of amusement. The young interns, fresh from college and eager to assert themselves, often laughed the loudest, calling him relic or suggesting he should ask for a raise to buy new shoes. Their words were never spoken to his face, but the volume of their mockery was intentional, just loud enough to carry across the hallways he cleaned each day. He never responded. His stride remained the same, measured and purposeful, as he pushed his cart of supplies from one floor to the next. He carried his broom, his mop, and his bucket with a kind of reverence, as though each tool mattered, as though the work they represented held meaning greater than the ridicule aimed at him. His dark skin glistened with sweat from the early morning tasks, but his back was always straight, his eyes focused on the floor ahead, not on those who mocked him. Those who paid closer attention saw something different. When he passed by the reception desk, he always greeted the staff with warmth, his deep voice carrying a steady kindness. When he emptied the bins in the break rooms, he hummed softly to himself, never hurrying, never cutting corners. When a paper jam clogged the printer or a light bulb flickered above someone's cubicle, he fixed it quickly, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they worked with precision. He gave his labor fully, not because anyone praised him for it, but because it was the right way to do the job. In moments when the building was quieter, his stride carried a certain dignity that could not be erased by scuffed shoes or a faded uniform. He moved as though he knew something the others did not, as though his worth was not measured by the leather on his feet or the brand stitched into his clothes. The mockery slid off him, not because it did not sting, but because he had long since learned that the noise of others could not touch the truth he carried inside. Every day he made his rounds, sweeping the lobby, wiping down glass doors, and polishing brass handles until they gleamed. And every day people in their crisp suits walked past, some sneering, some ignoring him entirely. Still, his stride never faltered. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his head high, his shoes scuffed but steady, moving through a world that underestimated him without ever truly seeing him. The janitor's cart squeaked softly as he pushed it down the hallway, the bucket rattling with every bump in the carpet. He moved slowly but with purpose, his mop propped carefully against the side, his gloves tucked neatly in the pocket of his faded uniform. The scent of cleaning solution trailed faintly behind him, a smell most people ignored, but one that marked his presence long before anyone looked his way. He had grown used to being overlooked, to blending into the background of the towering office building, but there were always those who made sure he could not forget his place in their eyes. A cluster of office workers gathered near the break room door, their voices loud, the easy laughter of people who believed themselves above reproach. One of them pointed openly at the janitor's shoes as he passed, the cracked leather scuffed from years of use. "Man, those shoes look like they've seen a war," the man said, his voice pitched high so that it carried down the hall. The group erupted in laughter, their faces turned toward him, though they pretended to be casual. Another chimed in, sipping from a paper cup. "Bet he found those in the lost and found 10 years ago and never gave them back." The janitor heard every word, but he did not stop. His back remained straight, his stride steady, as though the noise behind him was nothing more than the hum of the air conditioning. Yet the laughter followed him, sharper now, fueled by their confidence that he would not respond. "Shoes like that," one woman added with a smirk, "and he expects us to believe he's got his life together? He probably can't even afford a bus ticket home." Howden, their voices carried through the hallway, drawing the attention of passing interns and assistants. A few looked on with uncertain smiles, caught between discomfort and the pressure to join in. One of the men leaned his elbow against the wall, his grin wide. "Hey, maybe we should take up a collection," he said mockingly. Get him a new pair of shoes so the clients don't think we employ beggars." The laughter rolled again, louder, shameless in its cruelty. Behind the noise lay assumptions sharper than their words. They saw his old shoes and worn uniform and concluded he must be poor, that his life was a string of menial paychecks barely holding him above water. They saw the mop in his cart and decided he must be uneducated, that his hands knew only the weight of brooms and buckets, never books or ideas. Their laughter was not about shoes at all. It was about the story they had written for him, a story where he would never rise above the floors he scrubbed. The janitor kept walking, his eyes forward, his hands steady on the cart's handle. He did not flinch, though the sting of their mockery pricked at him, as it always did. He had heard variations of the same jokes for years. He had grown used to the sneers and the way people spoke of him as though he could not hear. Their voices had become background noise, but even so, the cruelty never entirely lost its bite. Still, he chose silence. He let them laugh, let them believe what they wanted to believe. He had long since learned that nothing he said would change their minds. Words, in their world, meant little when spoken by someone like him. Instead, he held himself with quiet composure, his stride unwavering. They laughed at his shoes and mocked his work, but they did not know that behind his silence was a man who had built something greater than any of them could imagine. And while their laughter echoed in the hallway, he carried on with the calm of someone who knew the truth would one day speak louder than their jeers. The laughter followed him as he pushed his cart to the end of the hallway, echoing off the polished walls and tiled floors. The jokes about his shoes, about his work, about who he must be clung to the air long after they were spoken, yet he gave no sign that he had heard them. His back remained straight, his hands steady on the handle of his cart, as though he were simply another fixture of the building, moving quietly through its routines. He stopped at the corner, lifted his mop, and set it carefully into the bucket of soapy water. With a slow and practiced motion, he began to sweep the mop across the floor, his strokes even and deliberate, his expression calm. The office workers who had been mocking him expected a reaction. They expected him to flinch, to turn with an angry glare, or at the very least to shrink under their words. Instead, he continued with the same quiet rhythm he had carried every day, his silence more piercing than any defense he could have spoken. A few of the interns who had laughed uncomfortably glanced at him again, their smiles faltering as they realized their voices had not shaken him. His calmness unsettled them, making their cruelty feel petty in contrast to the dignity with which he worked. He polished the brass handles on the doors with the same precision he always used, his large hands moving with care, his rag folded neatly. He emptied the bins without complaint, carrying away the discarded cups and crumpled papers left behind by people who rarely thought twice about the mess they made. He swept each section of the floor as though it mattered, pausing only to wring out the mop before starting again, his patience unbroken. Every movement carried a kind of grace, the quiet assurance of someone who knew his worth did not depend on their approval. Those who watched more closely felt the sting of their own laughter deepen. The janitor's silence was not weakness. It was a mirror, reflecting their cruelty back at them. His composure made their jeers seem louder, harsher, more shameful than they had sounded when they had first spoken. The man they thought they were mocking did not give them the satisfaction of anger or even acknowledgement. He simply carried on, his silence turning their performance into something small and mean. In the background, the hum of the office returned, phones ringing, printers humming, the sound of keyboards clicking. But the workers who had gathered near the break room door could not fully shake what they had seen. Their laughter no longer rang out with the same confidence. It dwindled into whispers, and some turned away, suddenly eager to look busy. The janitor's quiet endurance had stripped them of the power they believed they held. He finished the hallway, rinsed his mop, and pushed the cart forward without haste. His stride was measured, his head lifted, his eyes focused on the path before him. The scuffed shoes they had mocked tapped against the tiles with steady rhythm, each step a reminder that he moved forward regardless of their words. To him, the work mattered. To him, silence was strength. And in that strength, he carried a dignity that none of their cruelty could erase. The break room smelled of reheated leftovers and burnt coffee, the kind of scent that clung to the space no matter how often it was scrubbed. The janitor had grown familiar with it over the years, just as he had grown familiar with the hum of the refrigerator, the flicker of the fluorescent lights, and the way conversations always seemed to fall silent when he entered. On this day, he carried his cart in quietly, ready to empty the trash bins and wipe down the tables that had already collected crumbs and spills from the morning rush. A group of office workers were clustered around the table nearest the window, their laughter louder than usual. They leaned back in their chairs, sipping coffee from paper cups, their ties loosened and their shoes polished to a shine. One of them noticed the janitor's shoes as he stepped into the room, the leather scuffed and the soles worn, and his smirk widened. He nudged the man beside him and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Here comes old shoes," he said. "Bet those things have more mileage than my car." The others laughed, their voices carrying easily through the room. The janitor said nothing, just moved calmly toward the bin by the door, his gloves pulled on, his posture steady. But the silence only encouraged them. Another worker leaned forward across the table, his tone sharp with mockery. "Tell me something," he called out. "Do you even own anything valuable? Or is that mop the nicest thing with your name on it?" The room erupted in more laughter, some of it nervous, some of it cruel, as eyes turned toward the janitor. The man by the window was not done. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms wide as if holding court. "Come on, you must have something. A car that runs? A phone made in this decade? Maybe a bank account with more than pocket change?" His voice dripped with arrogance. The words meant not only to cut, but to entertain the others who watched. He thrived on their chuckles, their nods, their eagerness to see the janitor belittled. The janitor paused by the trash bin, lifting the bag out with practiced ease. He kept his eyes on his work, his silence unbroken. Yet the workers continued, their arrogance filling the room. Another spoke up, his voice mocking but curious. "Maybe he hides treasure in those old shoes. Wouldn't that be something? All this time he's walking around with gold stuffed under his feet." The laughter that followed was loud and careless, echoing against the walls of the cramped room. Their words were not just jokes anymore. They were challenges, demands to strip him of dignity in front of their peers. They wanted him to snap, to argue, to reveal himself as the man they imagined him to be. They wanted proof that he was small so they could feel larger. Their arrogance was heavy, their assumptions sharper than the laughter that surrounded him. Still, he said nothing. He tied off the trash bag neatly and replaced it with a fresh one. He wiped the counter with slow, deliberate motions, his silence stronger than any reply he could give. Yet inside, the sting of their words burned as it always did. They thought they knew him, thought their jokes painted the truth. They had no idea what he carried, no idea of the life he lived beyond the mop and the cart. Their challenge hung in the air, arrogant and sharp, but he knew the day would come when their laughter would falter. For now, he endured, his composure unbroken, his silence holding the weight of a truth they could not yet imagine. The laughter in the break room swelled, bouncing against the humming refrigerator and the flickering fluorescent lights. The janitor had tied off the trash bag and replaced it with a fresh liner, his movements calm, his posture steady, but the mocking voices pressed harder, feeding off one another. The workers leaned forward in their chairs, their polished shoes tapping lightly against the tiled floor, their grins sharp. They had made a sport of their cruelty, and the challenge still hung in the air. "Do you even own anything valuable?" Their words lingered like smoke, heavy and suffocating. For years he had endured it, the whispers about his shoes, the laughter about his uniform, the assumptions about his life beyond the broom and the mop. He had held his silence, telling himself that dignity lived in restraint, that their ignorance was not worth the weight of his words. But something shifted in him then, standing in that cramped break room with the arrogance of their voices clawing at him. Perhaps it was the smugness in their eyes, the certainty that they knew his worth. Perhaps it was simply the accumulation of years of silence pressing too heavily on his chest. Whatever it was, he decided that moment would be different. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the movement quiet and deliberate. The laughter did not stop at first. One of the men leaned toward another, nudging him with an elbow, whispering something about how the phone must be too old to even turn on. The janitor said nothing. He tapped the screen, his broad hands moving with practiced ease, unlocking it with the swipe of a finger. The room shifted slightly, the laughter pausing as curiosity began to creep in. He turned the screen toward them, his expression calm, his eyes steady. It was not a joke, not a bluff. The glow of the phone revealed an app, a portfolio that glittered with numbers. Rows of investments spread across the screen, their values climbing into figures the men had never expected to see from someone they had dismissed so easily. The bold numbers showed totals that dwarfed their salaries, investments worth more than a year of their collective work combined. Stocks and companies they read about in the news, holdings that prove not just luck but knowledge, years of careful planning and persistence. The silence that followed was sharp. The arrogance that had filled the room collapsed under the weight of undeniable proof. The men stared, their smirks gone, their mouths slightly open. One shifted in his chair, his hands tightening around his coffee cup. Another blinked rapidly, as though trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The mocking words that had rolled so easily off their tongues minutes before seemed to wither in the air. The janitor did not boast. He did not smirk or raise his voice. He simply held the phone steady for a moment longer, letting the truth rest where their laughter had been. His silence now was not endurance, but power. A mirror turned back on them, reflecting their smallness against the breadth of what he had built. He slipped the phone back into his pocket with the same quiet grace, then picked up his mop, setting it back in the bucket. The sound of water sloshing seemed louder than the worker's breathing. He resumed his task, sweeping the mop across the floor in smooth, even strokes, his posture unchanged. The room, once filled with arrogance, now carried only the weight of realization. Not one of them spoke. Their ridicule had been shattered by the simple glow of a screen, by the truth they had never thought to imagine. The janitor moved on, his silence now heavier than words, leaving them to sit in the echo of their own shame. By the next morning, the whispers had changed. The same mouths that had once curled into laughter now spoke in hushed tones of disbelief, repeating what had happened in the break room as though it were a story too strange to be true. They spoke of the janitor, the man in the faded uniform and the scuffed shoes, who had pulled out his phone and revealed a portfolio that shamed every insult they had ever thrown at him. The news moved quickly through the cubicles and conference rooms, carried on the breath of gossip and spreading like wildfire. Those who had mocked him most openly were the first to retreat. They no longer smirked when he passed with his cart, no longer leaned against the walls with loud jokes at his expense. Instead, they kept their eyes lowered, pretending to be absorbed in paperwork, their voices quieter when he was near. They shifted in their seats when his footsteps echoed down the hall, their faces flushed with guilt they could not admit aloud. The bravado that once accompanied their cruelty had vanished, leaving only the awkward silence of men who had been exposed. Others began to look at him differently. The interns who had once laughed nervously now straightened when he walked by, their expressions a mix of awe and curiosity. They whispered to each other about the numbers they had glimpsed on his phone, about the kind of knowledge it must take to build something so carefully. A few even dared to greet him with a nod, their respect tentative but genuine. The receptionists, who had always treated him kindly but with the polite detachment reserved for background staff, now watched him with new admiration. They began to realize that the old shoes they had once pitied were not signs of struggle but signs of restraint, of a man who valued substance over appearances. The office itself seemed to hum differently. In the break room where the mockery had once echoed, the laughter was subdued, the air heavy with the memory of their arrogance collapsing under truth. Conversations about stocks and investments sprang up, awkward at first, as workers tried to understand the world the janitor had mastered quietly in his own time. The same men who had taunted him now found themselves searching for articles on finance, trying to grasp what he had known all along. They avoided his gaze still, but their silence was no longer born of superiority. It was born of shame and the awareness that their assumptions had blinded them. For the janitor, nothing seemed to change outwardly. He pushed his cart as he always had, his step steady, his mop sweeping across the floors with patient strokes. His shoes were still scuffed, his uniform still worn, his voice still soft when he offered a greeting. But the way people looked at him had shifted. His silence no longer seemed like weakness. It had become a reminder that true wealth needed no announcement, that dignity required no show. Some began to see the lesson. They realized that humility had been mistaken for poverty, that patience had been mistaken for ignorance. His shoes were not a sign of what he lacked, but of what he valued. He had chosen not to flaunt, not to waste, not to impress the shallow eyes of those who had laughed at him. Instead, he had built quietly, step by step, until his strength revealed itself without warning. In that realization, admiration grew. It was not shouted, not displayed openly, but it lived in the softer greetings, in the careful nods, in the way people moved aside with respect when he passed. The turning point had come, and though his stride remained the same, the ground he walked on had shifted. He no longer carried the weight of ridicule. He carried the quiet recognition that dignity, even in worn shoes, could outshine arrogance wrapped in polish. The days that followed carried a different rhythm through the building. The janitor still rose before dawn, dressed in his same faded uniform, tied the laces of his scuffed shoes, and made his way to the tower of glass and steel. His cart still rattled along the hallways, stocked with the same tools he had used for years, and his mop still left its shining trails across the floor. Outwardly, nothing had changed about him, but the atmosphere around him was unmistakably different. The silence that once wrapped itself around his presence had shifted into a respectful pause, the kind of acknowledgement that had never been granted to him before. Where once eyes had rolled toward his shoes, now heads lifted with greetings. Some were hesitant at first, awkward hellos from people who had once laughed behind his back, but slowly those greetings grew steadier, warmer, even genuine. A receptionist began leaving him coffee in the mornings, a quiet gesture of respect. An intern who had once giggled at the cruel jokes now stopped him in the hallway to ask how he had learned to invest. The janitor listened patiently, his deep voice low as he told the young man that knowledge did not come from luck but from time, reading, and persistence. The intern nodded, scribbling notes as though every word were gold. It did not stop there. Word had spread so widely about his revelation in the break room that employees began to approach him one by one, some with timid curiosity, others with open admiration. They asked him about the stock market, about where to start, about how he had built something so quietly while everyone else was too busy mocking him. He never gloated, never reminded them of their cruelty. Instead, he answered with the same calm dignity he had carried while they jeered. He told them about saving, about patience, about resisting the temptation to spend money just to appear wealthy. He told them about his mistakes, about the times he had lost, and about the importance of learning from failure rather than fearing it. His humility disarmed them more than any display of arrogance ever could. Soon the break room that had once been filled with laughter at his expense became a space where people leaned in closer to hear his advice. The same table where they had ridiculed his shoes became the place where workers spread out their notebooks and asked him questions. Some began to call him mentor, not loudly, but in the way their voices softened when they asked for guidance. Through it all, he remained the same. His shoes were still worn, his uniform still faded, but he walked the halls taller, not because his stride had changed, but because the weight of ridicule no longer pressed against him. People stepped aside for him now, not out of pity, but out of respect. They saw not just the man with a mop, but the man who had proven that appearances deceive, that wealth is not always worn on the body, but often carried quietly within the mind. The janitor became more than a worker in the background. He became a quiet symbol of wisdom, a reminder etched into every polished floor and every freshly cleaned glass pane that dignity endures and true wealth does not need to announce itself. He had walked the halls ridiculed, and now he walked them admired, proving to everyone who had ever doubted him that value is not always in what people see, but in the truth